Everyone. So good to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us today for the next session in our Zooming Out speaker series. We have curated this Zooming Out series to help us all better understand the context and the environments that influence our work, and together discover ways that we can adapt based on what we are learning. Our Zooming Out series, now in its third year, supports our intentional efforts for adaptive learning. We recognize the need to be adaptable and flexible and nimble, especially during times of uncertainty and rapid change. And we also acknowledge the importance and the need and the power in this moment to strengthen our shared mission and make a lasting impact. At PCA America, one of our key strategies this year is focused on shifting mindsets and transforming the narrative around prevention. We understand the critical importance of changing hearts and changing minds to effectively influence policies and drive systemic change. We know that shifting mindsets has a profound impact on systems and policy change, more than any other leverage point. It also takes the most time to witness the transformation. So it's critical that we invest our time and our resources now, today, in narrative change, so that in our lifetime, we can see the outcomes that we've long desired for children and families in this country. Today, we are thrilled to have Ishita Srivastava, the Vice President of Cultural Strategy at Frameworks Institute. Ishita is a cultural strategist, narrative change practitioner, and multimedia producer with 15 years of experience working at the intersection of social justice movements and culture. Ishita uses Frameworks research to develop strategies focused on leveraging media, communications, art, and pop culture to shift cultural mindsets in ways that make societies more just and more equitable. There will be time for questions and discussion throughout Ishita's presentation today. And now I'll turn it over to Ishita. We've all talked about Ishita having the best name ever. And so Ishita, thank you so much for being with us today. We're really excited to dig in and hear what you have to share. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jen. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Can everyone see that? Yes, I see some nods. Okay, great. Um, Thank you so much for having me. Jen, thanks for that amazing setup. So as Jen said, my name is Ishita Srivastav. I'm the Vice President of Cultural Strategies here at the Frameworks Institute. I've been at Frameworks for about a year and a half, so I'm relatively new to Frameworks. I know Frameworks has worked with you all at PCA America doing sort of framing research over the years. I've been a cultural strategist, which is using media and pop culture specifically as a vehicle for narrative change to change mindsets for about 15 years. And I work with different organizations to kind of develop their cultural strategy as well as advise on the team and the infrastructure needed to actually implement it. I use she and her pronouns. I live in DC with my partner and my 5-year-old daughter, Samara, and our cat. I'm really grateful to be able to talk to you all today about probably my favorite thing to talk about, which is narrative change and strategy. And I know that this is a lot of time to hear one person talk virtually. So I really hope it's useful and interesting for you all. I'm going to go through the agenda so you know what's happening. So I'm going to first start with some kind of definitional information, some concepts that are really important to narrative change, narrative mindsets, framing, and story. Hopefully, this is useful for everyone, and I hope I'm not sort of sharing things that everyone already knows, but I find it really helpful as like a baseline to level set. Then I'm going to talk about narrative change and how it fits in with other social change strategies. As a part of this, I'm actually going to walk through how we've identified as the stages of narrative change, and I'm going to use an example that you all will be familiar with. And then I'm going to come to some tools to help planning and implementation of narrative change strategy. I'm going to stop kind of halfway for 10 minutes so people can ask me questions. Jen will facilitate that. And then at the end, I'm going to hopefully, if I've timed myself right, have 15 minutes again for you all to kind of ask questions. I'd also love to kind of hear, comments, thoughts about how this fits in with your work. And yes, and then I'm very happy to share the deck if it's useful for folks afterwards as well. All right, so I'm gonna get started. So what is narrative and what isn't? Nowadays, I feel like we hear the term narrative and narrative change a lot, and I find that people often don't have a super sort of clear sense of what a number of phrases in the narrative and culture change field mean and how they connect to one another. And if everything is narrative, then you have no way of evaluating and understanding whether and how stuff that is narrative actually works and how we use it as a vehicle of change. So for a definition, framework says that narratives are patterns of stories in public discourse, and I'm going to talk much more about this. So Jan talked about changing mindsets and as narrative as a vehicle for changing mindsets. So in the context of social change work, I find that narrative is sometimes used to mean narratives in discourse. So what we see and hear in the world, and then sometimes used to mean narratives in the mind, how we think and make sense of things. Often these terms are used interchangeably or assumed to mean the same thing, and as you can probably tell, they are not the same thing. And for strategy purposes, it's useful to distinguish between them. So at Frameworks, we use the term mindsets, cultural mindsets, or cultural models to describe patterns in public thinking. Cultural mindsets are the deep,
About the narrative.
Cultural mindsets are the deep, implicit, assumed, and widely shared patterns of thinking that shape how we make sense of the world and what we do in it. And if we shift these, we can start to change what makes sense to people. What is seen as common sense, what is seen as nonsense, making a lot of new things possible that previously weren't. And then we use the term narrative to refer to patterns of stories in the world. So in public discourse, in communication, and pop culture, stories that are repeated again and again. So narrative and story. Narratives are the templates, and then stories are the specific telling. So narratives are recurring patterns that cut across stories and tie them together. Stories are tales about particular events and people. They have similar features like character, plot, setting, and point of view, and they feed each other. So particular stories draw from overarching narratives, and then the patterns in narratives can only exist because many different stories carry them and embody them. And there's examples on the slides. I'm going to actually get to this example very soon, so this will feel more concrete. Narratives have features of story, but what they do is they tie these features and these stories together and give rise to sort of familiar themes or stories. Narratives are kind of the big themes, patterns, and clumps of meaning that exist in the world. And then the last one is sort of the relationship between framing and narrative. Framing involves choices about how something is presented, what is and isn't emphasized, how it's explained, what connections are made, which commitments are invoked. Framing choices are not context specific. So the same frame or value, like freedom, can be applied in very different ways in different contexts. Framing choices are also embedded in narratives. So values like, again, in the bootstraps narrative that's in this example, a value like hard work or self-sufficiency is embedded in that narrative, and it's used time and time again. Framing choices can also be applied in ways that are not to do with overarching narratives. So in a scientific argument or in a moral appeal. But when framing choices that have been tested are embedded in narratives, the result can be a very powerful way to sort of shift mindsets. And that's how kind of we at Frameworks fit into this world of narrative change and mindset shift. And I'll talk a bit more about kind of how that change happens in a bit. Okay, so now the example. So I'm going to talk about the mindset of individualism, which is a mindset that Frameworks has been tracking for 25 years. In this country, it is a very powerful mindset. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all that. So in this example, the mindset of individualism involves the assumption that outcomes are almost exclusively a result of people's choices, individuals' character, choices, willpower, hard work, grit, gumption. This mindset is activated by the bootstraps narrative, can be activated by the bootstraps narrative, where an individual down on their luck struggles to overcome obstacles but beats the odds and succeeds. And then this narrative is carried through hundreds of stories you can find all over pop culture and has been for decades. The TV show, the Disney movie Mulan, the TV show Empire, there's like thousands of examples, as well as in many of these stories, the framing choices that are employed, like values like self-sufficiency and hard work, they help carry the narrative, the bootstraps narrative. But even sort of other kinds of framing choices are even like decisions of whether we say each or every. It makes a difference in whether we activate individualism as a mindset or not. And so in this example, multiple stories reinforce the narrative, the bootstraps narrative, and then the bootstraps narrative activates the mindset of individualism. So that's kind of the way these connect to each other. And you can imagine, and I'll get to this, so I don't want to get ahead of it, but if we activate a counter narrative, then we can potentially activate a more productive mindset than individualism. The mindset that counters individualism is called structuralism or contextualism, the idea that what surrounds us shapes us. And so a different narrative could activate a different mindset. I think this is a slightly cheeky slide, but I think it's important. Nowadays, a lot of things are referred to as narrative that are not narratives, specifically patterns in language that aren't narratives. And in order to kind of design and implement narrative strategies, we need to know what we're talking about. So some things that are not narratives, themes. So narratives can have themes, but themes in and of themselves are not narratives. Talking points, pre-established messages, we all use them a lot, repeated in a coordinated way, not narrative. Arguments, a media angle, a value. Value is actually a frame. It's not a narrative. It's an element of narrative. It can be embedded in narrative, but it's not a narrative. And then my favorite one. So strategic communications, which all of us do and is a really important tool. This one is important because I think it's conflated with narrative strategy a lot. I see it as a tactic of narrative strategy, but strategic comms can also be used for other outcomes that are not about changing narratives. It's strategic comms can be used for like a goal, like, running a campaign where you want to have a bus stop situated in a particular place. That's not necessarily narrative change. It could ladder up to a narrative change strategy, but in and of itself, it isn't. And strategic communications it's a tool and could be used for all kinds of different things. It in itself requires a different kind of level of resource and infrastructure than narrative change. So I think it's important not to conflate them. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about narrative change as a strategy for social change. So our understanding of reality is not solely determined by objective facts. We all know this, but by cultural mindsets. And then in turn, the way we perceive reality can either justify systems as they are or motivate us to change them for the better. So this is why we want to change mindsets. This is why we want to leverage narrative change as a strategy. So how does it actually work in support of social change? Like, what is the mechanism? So it aims to shift cultural mindsets by introducing or amplifying counter narratives. So there's a dominant narrative, which is the prominent, prevalent way of depicting an issue or a group or a topic. So meritocracy narrative. When people succeed, it's the result of their own talents and hard work. And then the counter narrative resists the dominant narrative by providing a different way of looking at that group or that topic. So the 99% narrative is a counter narrative to the meritocracy one. Our country is designed to work for the wealthiest 1%. We, the 99%, can come together to change it. Counter narratives can be emergent, so they can arise organically from a movement or community's experience, in this case, Occupy Wall Street. They can also be cultivated, developed deliberately, strategically through research by strategists, advocates. But because cultural mindsets are deep and durable, narrative change strategies must be large scale and long term to have the desired effect. And it's really important that they're multimodal, appearing in different formats and different kinds of communication and discourse. One way to think about it is we start with a vision of what we want to see. Then we do some research to figure out which mindsets will put people in a place where they can see the importance and power of that vision and they can actually demand it. Then we identify which counter narratives need to be advanced. And then we advance them through the stories we tell in ways that are strategically framed. Some examples of counter narratives, I'm going to just throw these examples out. I will talk about one soon. Love is love for the LGBTQ movement. That was a cultivated narrative. Black Lives Matter, that was a narrative. That was, and I'll go into that example in a little bit. So how does narrative change fit in with kind of other strategies of social change? So this is a theory of change that I developed at Frameworks with my colleagues. And this graphic illustrates the interconnection between some common social change strategies that you all use all the time, deploy all the time, narrative change, and then the ultimate outcomes, which we talk about as systems change and mindsets change, which Jen, you also did just now. So narrative and narrative change efforts are a key part of these three pillars of social change strategy, which are depicted in the cube on the left. Policy change and advocacy work, cultural strategy, which is building cultural power, which is the work I do, which is leveraging media, pop culture, and entertainment, and then organizing, building people power. So if these strategies are being deployed in coordination, then the same narrative change effort can serve to connect and move complementary policy change work, organizing work, and cultural strategy goals. So at my last job, which was at an organization called Caring Across Generations, the same narrative change goal of replacing the narrative that care is an individual responsibility with one that cares a collective responsibility that needs public solutions. So that was a narrative change goal. And that animated our policy work, advocacy campaigns, our organizing work, and the work I did with entertainment. And in all these cases, framing recommendations, storytelling strategy is all part of how you design the narrative change strategy. So the idea is that when narrative change strategies are deployed strategically, leveraging framing and storytelling, and used as part of policy advocacy, organizing, and culture change work, at scale, over time, it can lead to a shift in mindsets and systems. Some things to sort of remember here, narratives are a means to an end. They are not an end in themselves. So narratives are powerful, but the existence of a new narrative is not the end goal. This narrative change matters because of the effects of narrative and the idea that they can help shift mindsets, which can change social norms and shift systems. And it's important to kind of articulate the ultimate goal, sort of what is narrative change in service of. Then narrative as a form is a powerful way of framing an issue for a couple of reasons. One is that narratives involve many stories, many storytellers, and many audiences. And because a narrative is then amplified, its saturating presence in public discourse can shift mindsets. And the second thing is that stories have a distinctive effect on thinking, on memory, on emotion. And because of that, narratives can maximize the effects of their framing choices that they carry. So we do a lot of framing work that's just kind of not through story necessarily. And that's also powerful, but there's a particular power that stories have. And so sort of narrative change of that kind is really important. The choices influence thinking in the moment by pulling a more productive mindset to the forefront. So that happens in the moment, but actually also over time. And that's why we need to do this work over time, is because then it affects the relative dominance of a mindset over time. So individualism has become a dominant mindset because it is those narratives are repeated again and again and again, and have been for forever. And then just the last thing here is to say that narrative change is one type of social change strategy. Not every social change strategy seeks to change patterns of stories in public discourse. So it's really important to be clear about like why we're using narrative change, what are the outcomes, and why shifting that narrative matters. So I'm going to pause here, and Jen, I'm going to hand it to you to see if there's any questions about this first part. And then after this, I'm going to move into kind of tools to help plan and implement narrative strategy. But we have about 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Ishita. That was awesome. A lot of really sort of complex stuff, right? Right in the beginning in a short period of time. I don't see anything. I do now see something. I was about to say I don't see anything in the chat, but here's one thing, and then I actually have a question or two, if you don't mind, and then we can see if others throw some other questions in the chat. So Hannah just put a question in the chat asking, how does imagery affect narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. So imagery can function, visual images can function as a framing choice, essentially. And so one of the things that I'm actually starting to do with the research team at Frameworks is to test visuals in addition to testing words. And we have actually done that in the past for a couple of projects, but it does it totally affects narrative. So if you use the same, if you think about some dominant narratives and you think about the same image being used again and again, and that's why, like, you think of the love is love narrative. I mean, you think of that flag. It's become kind of an iconic image. And that's a very literal example because it's a flag, but that's an example of where that image is now connected with that narrative, is connected with, for a lot of people, the policy, the systems, and so it carries with it that meaning. So and that's true for images that are less sort of icons and more sort of just elements of story. But yeah, we are beginning to test visuals and images as well. It is absolutely a framing choice that has an effect on the narrative.
Excellent. So I'm gonna one thing, and you may get to this, Ishita, but so if you do, you can just kind of, if you are going to get to it, feel free to sort of pass it along. But why is it so difficult to change narrative in this country, or in any country, I would imagine? But I feel like in particular, it's pretty difficult to change narrative in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's many reasons. So I think, and I will get to not why it's so difficult, but I think as I'm talking about what the strategy that's really needed to make it happen looks like, that's one reason it's hard. I think from an intentional perspective, I don't know that like movements and sort of the philanthropic space or has really understood and grappled with what it takes in terms of infrastructure, in terms of time, in terms of resource, in terms of capacity to actually do intentional narrative change. So that's one reason it's so difficult, is we don't actually have the infrastructure to do it. So people are kind of piecemealing infrastructure, and then we don't have actually the timelines to implement a strategy in the way, like I say 10 to 15 years minimum. Now that's just not how grants work. That's not how things are set up and programs are set up. I mean, that said, it has been done. And I'll say, like, there's a lot of so the resource piece is huge. So if you think about smoking, for instance, as a like the shift in sort of mindsets around smoking, it was an intentional advertising and narrative play to make smoking cool and sexy. And then there was an intentional play to kind of, which was combined with policy advocacy work to change the narrative and to change the narrative on that. And a lot of money was pumped into that, both sides. And the thing is, advertising has the infrastructure to put the same narrative out again and again and again. And because of how ads work and in our sort of media sphere, at least, and they did then, I'd say it's a little different now, you can create that narrative saturation through advertising. I'd say, like, someone who's been in the sort of nonprofit space for doing this work for 16 years, we're just not set up for it. That's one reason. And then I would say the additional piece of the way in which the media landscape has shifted in the last 10 years makes it much, much harder. So when Norman Lear was producing television content in the 70s and intentionally bringing in narratives about different social issues, a lot of people were watching the same channels and the same shows. So it was easier, not that it was being done on a huge scale, but it was easier in that media landscape to have a kind of like narrative strategy that's saturated. Even when GLAAD really started pushing into the intentionally pushing sort of gay representation specifically on television, there was a less fragmented media. It was pretty fragmented, but it wasn't like it is today. So the number of people that watched Will and Grace was pretty huge. And so you could kind of put all your eggs in like one basket or a couple of shows and reach a lot of people. You can't do that anymore. You can't even be on one platform or focus on one. You can't even say, I'm just going to work in television. You have to work in television, and then you also have to work in the digital spaces, and then you also have to focus on podcasts and actually maybe gaming. And it's just, that's kind of a huge, I think it makes it very, very difficult to really get a narrative to have like that kind of saturation and dominance.
So basically what I'm hearing is we need money, infrastructure, and a TV show, and then we should be able to change the narrative.
Yeah, that's
Excellent.
right. And
All right.
I'm gonna lay some of this out very soon. And I want people to try not to feel like overwhelmed and like it's impossible, because there are ways to do it. And as long as you kind of understand the ideal infrastructure situation, I think there are ways to do it without having all of it laid out.
Yeah.
But it is, it is an ambitious task.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and then I'll go to the question in the chat, but it's interesting because when we see, I feel like we, meaning sort of we in the public, the general public, when we see things or narratives like love is love or Black Lives Matters, right? It feels like, well, for me anyway, if it's like, oh, that's just a really cool tagline, right? Or that's just a really
Right.
great sort of inspiring statement. But it seems like, or it sounds like, what I'm hearing from you, Ishita, is that there's a whole sort of strategy behind this, right? Like there are people that are intentionally identifying and probably researching, right, and evaluating and testing these ideas around sort of love is love and other things. And so I'm sure you're going to get to that, but if there's anything you want to comment there, before I go to the next question, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, that is all true. Also, things sometimes take off. Like, it's not to say that things don't take off like without the initial research. But I think if it's going to have legs for many years and change mindset, so Oscars so white became a trending hashtag. There was an individual who pushed that on Twitter and had it take off, and it actually had an impact on that year's the program design. Did it have a lasting impact? Like, did it continue? I guess is the question. And it didn't, because she didn't really have the infrastructure to do much with it beyond that. And so I think there's a lot that can happen organically. Most things don't happen organically. Most things have, for sure, money and to a great extent, strategy and testing behind them.
Great. So we got a couple more here, Ishta. One is, what is the impact of public media literacy or lack thereof on narrative change?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think so. There's a couple of things. There's like misinformation and disinformation, which is when you're designing a narrative strategy, it's a big barrier. It's a big issue. That said, I think, and I'm not saying that media literacy is just about misinformation and disinformation, but I think that for me, the key piece here, and I will get to this, is really understanding and having a sense, maybe a tiered sense of a strategic target audience, and then working from there on the platforms, the types of content that you want to push your narrative out through. And I say that because media literacy is an issue, and we kind of can't solve that before we implement narrative change. And so you have to kind of work with that, if depending on who your audience is. if your audience is sort of dealing with a lot of mis and disinformation, you kind of have to play in the spaces that that's happening in. And what I mean by that is, who are the TikTok influencers that they are listening to or watching? Some of whom might be spreading misinformation, disinformation. And can we collaborate with them? Or is there a way to pull some of those eyeballs to a different influencer who's still in the same kind of wheelhouse, but more amenable to working with you? So I think that it's something you have to kind of keep in mind, and it's part of the narrative landscape. And it's really about who the target audiences are. And I think it is imperative to like identify target audiences and then design the strategy for them rather than for everyone, because that's impossible. And you can't have a strategy that's for everyone.
Yeah, and I feel like oftentimes that's sort of what we do in the nonprofit space, right? We're just like, we want to reach everyone. Everyone is our focus audience. And so we don't we're not intentional or strategic, if you will, about sort of here is the message, here are the people, this is the audience. And I think, you know, what I'm hearing, what I'm taking away is that we need to be really sort of specific, so that we can address some of the noise, if you will, out in the space. So,
Yeah.
Ishita, we have 2 questions here, and I think that's probably, and then we can probably we'll play with these ones, and then if you want to hit back into your presentation, and that sounds good. So the first one is, you mentioned the current context in which folks are living in entirely different realities from different information sources, some of what you were just alluding to, right? And social media algorithms have aggravated those divisions. AI is going to have an exponential effect. And I feel, this person said, I feel like it's hard to even imagine how narratives will be distributed in 10 to 15 years. So wasn't really a question here, but anything
Yeah.
any context or, any response there?
Yeah, I would say that the main thing to know about this kind of work is that you have to set up infrastructure. You have to have a clear direction and strategy, and you have to set up infrastructure that can be nimble about that strategy and flexible about that strategy, and be able to test how what you're doing is landing and working as the media landscape changes. That's like, yeah, that's imperative. So, as someone that has primarily worked with television and film, done other work, but that's been my main work for a long time, I think I have to move focus to some extent to sort of digital spaces and podcasts. And it's not like I haven't done work there, but I would say that's in the last 10 years, I feel like, or even in the last 3 years, the way I think the balance of power has shifted in terms of where narratives are really like landing and living. It means we have to shift as cultural strategists. I'm not saying television is not important. Again, it's a question of audience. But certainly, I think a lot more focus on, um, you know, spaces in which even Reddit, I'll use the example of Reddit. For a couple of years, I was like, and I was working on care and caregiving, had a very particular audience that was not necessarily on Reddit, but that's changed in the last 2 years. And so thinking about strategy on Reddit, I mean, I think that has flexibility, it has to be built in. And for that, you need infrastructure and resources, you know?
So Ishita, the next one we have, and actually we think we might have a room for a couple more if or time for a couple more if people have any right now. But is it necessary to reach agreement on narrative change from the current political leaders to be successful? Or can narrative change happen when political powers are pushing the counter narrative? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, it can, I think. And I think it's narrative fighting narrative, right? So people with influence pushing out a narrative that is harmful and is taking up a lot of space makes the job harder. And it could be coming from anywhere. I mean, political leaders in this country have a lot of narrative power, that's kind of how politics works here. Like, I grew up in India where political leaders don't have the kind of narrative power that they do here. And so, yeah, I think it's harder to politics and political leaders take up a lot of narrative space. And so finding space for counter narratives becomes harder. And I would say all the more reason to work in the realm of pop culture, all the more reason to focus on places that people go to dream, to escape, to imagine, in moments where a lot of narrative space is being taken up. I'd say the additional issue here is that what we're dealing with is not just taking up narrative power, it's also changing systems and structures in a media and entertainment space. And so they become less open to collaborating. So that's something that is a systemic issue. It's not like those spaces are like sitting around waiting for us to walk up to them and talk to them about our narrative change work. So it's already hard to collaborate. And I think in this kind of atmosphere, it's harder because, they're kind of getting let off the hook, actually. They don't need to do any of this in this current climate. So there's other sort of systemic issues as a result of the current political situation. But I'd say from a narrative perspective, it's really important to dive into spaces that seem further away from those from those harmful narratives, if that makes sense. I don't know if that was articulate, but
Of course. I do want to ask one more question, and then we can and I'll send it back to you to go through the rest. But so the question I asked a little bit earlier about like how it feels difficult, sort of, right, to make narrative change in this country. But then if you look at, the gay marriage movement or the love is love narrative that you talked about, I feel like that happened in what felt like a short amount of time, because it happened in our lifetime. Like we saw it not so good, right? Sort of the percentage of people that supported it, and then that went way up after sort of the strategic and intentional campaign around Love is Love and trying to get gay marriage approved. So do you, Ishita, are there a couple of things that you would sort of point out from that campaign that you would say this is why it was so successful in such a short period of time? So just wanted to hear from you.
yeah,
There are things we could learn there, I would imagine.
absolutely. It's actually the only example we have, unfortunately, and there's some studies that have been done about that. I'd say the things I would point to is one, there was actually a pretty solid collaboration between the policy advocacy work at the national and state level on that issue, the organizing of LGBTQIA people, but also their families and allies, and the cultural strategy work that was happening behind the scenes. And GLAAD led that. Someone called Rashad Robinson really led that. He was then at Color of Change for many years. And it was really the first time there was a lot of money put into working with pop culture and entertainment. So the L Word, Will and Grace, all of those shows, there was work happening behind the scenes on those characters, on those storylines, consulting on scripts, reviewing cuts. Like a lot of work happened behind the scenes, and it wasn't just those big shows. It was also smaller storylines in other content. And it was far from perfect. And it's one of those things where, well, I won't go into the details of my opinion on kind of what got left out, which has to often happen from a strategic perspective. I think the trans sort of piece got left out strategically. It really focused on sort of the like gay men. A lot of gay men kind of funded that work. But to say that there was a very collaborative strategy, intentional across these pillars, and there was a lot of money pumped into the entertainment piece, but also into corporate work. So it wasn't just pop culture, it was also working behind the scenes with some big kind of corporate entities, there were campaigns that were run. Suddenly it became cool to be, in like the New York Pride Parade, if you had a company and the company wanted to float, like a lot of culture work that was not just about television, that was happening intentionally behind the scenes. And that's also organizing, like organizing a lot of queer people in corporations, queer people in entertainment, who then push this work forward. So yeah, and that it has kind of been studied. It did happen in a relatively short period of time.
Awesome. Thanks, Ishtal. I'll send it back to you to continue
Great.
your presentation.
Okay, so all right. So we've developed some planning tools and checklists that are kind of based on questions that we've received from practitioners, advocates, strategists like yourselves, and funders who kind of want to implement or in the middle trying to implement narrative change. So I'm going to share some of those with you. I know you're all wondering, like, what does it actually look like when it starts? So when it happens, so I'm going to share that, and then an example is coming. So as I've said many times already, narrative change takes decades, not months. Maintaining commitment and discipline to this work, the funding, the partnerships can be difficult. So it helps to have a sense of kind of the stages of the process, even though this is really important. It is not linear. It is often one step forward, two steps back. But it's really important to kind of keep this in mind. And so we've sort of come up with these stages of narrative change. The first is the emergence stage, where you have a strategy and a narrative product. It hasn't been disseminated that much, but the new narrative or the counter narrative exists. It has been tested. It's based on research that we call this research narrative intelligence. I'll talk a bit about that little later on, but this is research that identifies the mindsets that need shifting, the productive mindsets you want activated, identifies target audiences, as I mentioned, what platforms, what communications mechanisms, where are they really living in the narrative space, these audiences, and then designing some tactics around that, testing the new narrative and some framing pieces to see how they land with those audiences. So that's happened in this first phase. There's not a ton of narrative infrastructure yet, but it's being built. Second phase is the developing phase. At this stage, the new narrative has been disseminated strategically and widely, and it's regularly accessed. So people know it, and it resonates with them. And there's some narrative infrastructure that exists to continue to carry this narrative through culture in strategic ways that are also flexible. The third is the advanced stage. By this stage, the desired narrative has power and has the ability to build power for the people and the decisions that need to be centered, whatever that looks like. And it started to affect changes in the material reality in some form, ideally like some policy change. And then the last one is the obvious one. It has been the achieved stage. The new narrative has become the dominant narrative, and there's a measurable shift in mindsets, but also is being reflected in systems and structures. So I'm going to just show these stages with the Black Lives Matter narrative example. In the emergent stage, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, the Movement for Black Lives, came up with both the sort of slogan, but also the bigger narrative that Black Lives Matter. It was developed in 2012. And by 2013, there was a pretty powerful sort of ground up way of diffusing this narrative, primarily through social media. But the dominant mindset was still that policing creates safety, not harm. By the developing stage, which was I'd say a decade after the first one, the movement's narrative that Black lives are inherently worthy and should not be subjected to violence perpetrated by the state had a strong narrative presence. It had been disseminated widely and was regularly accessed. And we could see an opening for mindset shift. So 54% of white folks viewed police shootings as a sign of a broader problem that needed to change. And when I say this was disseminated widely, there was an organization, many, but Color of Change had taken it up and was basically working on a ton of television content on crime procedurals. So to kind of get the specific narrative about, that the Movement for Black Lives came up with into television, but there were all kinds of organizations. It was not just the Movement for Black Lives. It was being used by individual journalists, by other content creators. People had kind of taken it as their own. I'd say the third stage is where we are now, after some steps back. And while this narrative has influenced mindsets, it has not become dominant across sort of society. Given that many of the policy goals of this movement are still unmet, it seems fair to say that the narrative power is nascent, but not fully realized. So I'd say we're somewhere here at this point. And this was not, it was tested and sort of intentionally disseminated, but they didn't have sort of the infrastructure for the long term. And then the last stage is aspirational when it comes to this. We haven't reached it yet, but they had laid out very clearly kind of their goals for this stage. So there's a sense of what this looks like, which I think is important to have. So I'm just gonna sort of use the same model to talk about assessing this. Like, how do you know what's happening at what stage? So because these efforts unfold across long time horizons, it can be tricky to check and track progress. These are some ways to look at the different phases. So for the first phase, it's important to kind of, ideally this phase where there's a narrative product is based on research to start with. And at that point, the research mechanisms are also set up to track and evaluate along the way. For the second phase, it's about how far has it reached? Is it actually reaching the prioritized audiences? And how are those audiences actually receiving it, responding to it, interacting with it? For the narrative power stage, this is, I would say, a really hard one to assess because it's about salience. So one thing is that is it in influential settings and channels? Is it being used by people who are influential, have narrative power? Has it been picked up organically? Is it being picked up organically by others? And then, of course, actually testing like the mindsets that you're hoping to move at this stage. So has it sparked changes in mindsets, policies, practices? And that's something that, there's narrative tracking work, there's mindset tracking work, and then there's actually tracking the policies, the systems and structures that you want to shift. So, and then seeing how the narrative actually interacts with the audiences that it's trying to reach, doing opinion polling on those audiences. So there's like a whole set of sort of evaluation infrastructure that needs to be set up from the beginning that is geared towards the goals, but then can also be adjusted as things change along the way. And then in the narrative dominance one, I would say when things start to move where you kind of can see that happening. So of course, like in the Love is Love place, in the Love is Love case, there was the actual like laws changed. But where I used to work at Carrying Across, I would say that after 7 years of doing the culture change work and knocking on doors of television shows and filmmakers and studios, in my last year there, suddenly we were getting incoming all the time. Hey, I have a care storyline in this TV show. Hey, I'm doing PR for a new film. Can you help me with how, bringing sort of your narratives into our work? And that, I'm not saying we were at the dominance, that it was the narrative dominance place at all, but there's things like that where you can start to see people sort of taking up the narrative on their own. And in the last phase, of course, it's how much has it replaced or marginalized the previously dominant narrative, and how closely do the systems match the aspirations of the counter narrative. So now I'm going to share some like guiding questions to help plan and strategize this work. First, narrative change is most appropriate for pretty broad social issues, not ones that are super niche or narrow. So this is a tool for strategists to evaluate, and I'm going to share all this. Does a narrative change strategy make sense for the goal? Is the issue too niche or narrow? Does it lend itself to storytelling? Does the level of need justify the scale of the effort? What is the impact of not shifting this narrative? What are the mindsets that need to be shifted? Does the issue area already have a network of organizations and partners that could really participate in the amplifying of a narrative change effort? Next, this is a tool for strategists looking for ways to kind of refine an early plan for this work and for funders to start to understand what the strategy needs to encompass, because they are very important to making this happen. So, refining an early idea. These are some questions to ask. What are the goals? What are the existing narratives that are harmful? And what do the new narratives and stories need to include? Who are the strategic audiences that are required for this change to take place? How will it fit in with other social change strategies that are working to advance the same goal? Who are the best messengers for this narrative? Whose stories need to be included, and what will it take to include them? I think this is a piece that often gets left out. It's not just about the right stories, it's about the right stories about the right people and what it takes to include those stories, which is often like I had at Caring Across, I'm just throwing in a quick example, but at Caring Across, we worked on care and caregiving. So we worked with family caregivers and care workers. And I created a council of caregivers and care workers that were media trained and trained to come into writers' rooms so that I was able to kind of bring people's lived experience into those rooms, but also serve as a mediator and make sure that their stories and their voices were not being sort of extracted or exploited. And so that's like with any kind of storytelling, it's important to kind of have that piece, from the beginning. What does it take to have those people's stories there? What do we need to test before moving forward? What is the research infrastructure that's needed? And then how will the research and information developed, which we call like narrative intelligence, be shared in a way that helps build narrative infrastructure and achieve scale? Because I found that ideally, even issues that are different can be working on similar narrative change goals, can be doing similar kinds of mindsets research, and it helps to kind of share that with a broader field because there are such limited resources to do this work. So what does narrative strategy really look like? Planning for this is difficult because there aren't models for easy replication. And it's not work that can be done by one organization alone, though having a backbone organization that is really leading and is able to lead is very, very important. It's really important to be flexible. There's a lot to consider, but a plan informed by research is essential. So based on the answers to the questions we just asked in that refining an early idea, these are some of the elements for a strategic plan for narrative change. So you establish goals and objectives to be refined based on narrative intelligence and research about mindsets, narratives, and strategic audiences. Then you actually start to conduct the narrative intelligence, the research, some of which helps you get going, but it also needs to happen at different points of time. Build a strategy that lays all this out. Establish or build the infrastructure and capacity needed to implement the strategy. Which roles and relationships already exist and which ones need to be added. Build relationships across this ecosystem. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a couple of minutes. And then establish the measurement and evaluation frameworks and tools. Here are some potential tactics. There's a lot of different tactics, and these are like big buckets, and I've already kind of touched on them. But depending on what the goals are and what the research surfaces, you'd ideally be using all of these in some way, but these are kind of different vehicles and tactics. There's policy advocacy, so incorporating, and many of you do this already, incorporating the sort of new narratives into policy language, into advocacy campaigns. Grassroots organizing, leveraging the new narratives to build and amplify the power of the people closest to the problem. Cultural strategy, engaging creative journalists, writers, influencers to diffuse new narratives through their content. I talked a bit about the work I do in this space. I'll give you an example. I mentioned the narrative at Caring Across of moving people from thinking about care as an individual responsibility to a public issue that needs collective solutions. I we did a couple, I'm going to throw out a couple of examples. We worked on a feature film called Familiar Touch, where we worked on the script and kind of worked with the director and the filmmaker to bring our sort of narrative and kind of the texture and the stories that make up that narrative into their existing story, which was about a woman who was kind of aging and moving into a care home, and sort of her experience and the agency she had in kind of designing the end of her life. It was a beautiful film, but we didn't just work on the film. Once the film started making it to festivals, we actually worked with the team on all their sort of PR talking points. So suddenly this film was winning awards at Venice, and when they spoke to the press, they actually used our narrative extremely successfully. We had given them all the stuff for that, and we'd been working with them for like a year and a half, so they were pretty ready with that. Then we worked with the television show This Is Us, which was like my dream project. I'm sure many of you know the show, but we didn't work on the script. But in the final season of the show, there was a caregiving storyline that was pretty prominent, and they were doing a beautiful job, I thought. And so we reached out to NBC, and I asked if we could collaborate with them on a digital campaign where we created some bonus content for their audience that would drop right after the final episode. So this audience, including me, was like devastated. The show is over. There's no more content. What can we give them that connects the dots between the care storyline in the show and the narrative that we were trying to move, and kind of the policy landscape and everything else. And so we did that with them, with NBC, so we could reach their audience. And then, of course, strategic comms is another avenue. What does it look like to kind of implement this strategy? So again, the idea of a backbone organization that can lead this over a period of 10 to 15 years. These are, obviously no one organization is going to start off with all these characteristics, but it's just important to keep these in mind. It helps to have narrative change expertise, a commitment to long-term work, obviously the resources and the commitment to building and devoting these kinds of resources that are needed for this collaborative approach, because this can only be accomplished through the work of many kinds of organizations and entities. It's important to have collaboration across different kinds of entities and kind of an ecosystem approach. Multifaceted strategy is helpful. Again, being able to do policy work, cultural strategy, and organizing that pushes the narrative strategy through is important. Being able to be flexible and adapt to changes along the way. A commitment to data-driven decision-making, so using research to actually inform decision-making and measure the impact of the work along the way so you can change. And adaptability is really important. This is just kind of a quick view of like the different kinds of sectors that it takes, partnerships across these sectors. And then I'm going to zoom out. Don't be overwhelmed. But this is sort of a sense of the kind of investment that's necessary. This is the kind of ecosystem that usually needs to be activated, or pieces of it, to implement the strategy that we just discussed. Media organizations, obviously news outlets, documentary filmmakers, cultural influencers, the entertainment industry, film, TV, music, sports. There's a lot of interesting work happening sort of with like women's football. Like there's a lot of interesting sort of room to work there, gaming, cultural institutions, depending on the kind of work and the kind of like cultural organizing work you want to do, museums, theaters, libraries, obviously the nonprofit space, think tanks, research organizations, academic institutions, and the public sector as much as it's available and around to support, obviously policymakers and agencies. So that is all I have for you all today. I know that's a lot, and I hope it doesn't feel overwhelming. Again, like I said, it is a lot that is required to make this happen. This is the broadest and deepest sketch of what is required. And I feel like if we dig into it, a lot of you are doing like half of this or, parts of this already. So it's really about building out the pieces that are needed, but also sharpening the strategy and the research piece of it. So yeah, that's it. And Jen, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Excellent. Excellent. Also, Kirsten, do you want to, do you need this slide up?
No, I can,
Okay,
yeah, I can stop sharing. I do have a
okay,
link
stop
I'd
sharing.
love
Yeah.
to drop at the end. That's like a survey if people have time for it, but I will stop sharing in the meantime.
Yeah, and then we can bring it back up. Awesome. So we have a few minutes here. There is a question from Kiki from organizations or for organizations that are new to the cultural strategy and working collaboratively with media. How would you recommend we approach this type of work or build the skills and the capacity to be effective in this space? So basically, where do we start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would always start at the sort of that slide where I said like, what are the goals of like why do you want to do cultural strategy? And then sort of who are the target audiences? Because otherwise, I mean, it's overwhelming anyway, but without answers to those questions, to just narrow down, who do you want to reach? And that who do you want to reach can come from, existing audience work that your comms team has already done, your organization has already done around like, or if you do organizing, sort of like having a way, if there's existing work, otherwise doing sort of an audience map, working with an agency or someone to help sort of do that to understand, like, even if it's like ultimately we all want to reach everyone, but if you can't reach everyone and you can't, then who is the first, second, third. I've even done campaign plans where there's like 3 layers of audiences, but they have to be relatively narrow. So that then you can say, okay, we need to work here. And then there's folks that then look into those audiences and give you a sense. You can buy the data, like where are these audiences living online and what kind of media are they consuming, so that then you can narrow down sort of how to get to them. And if you can't sort of work, I mean, the good and bad thing about the digital space is that now, most people are living online, not just consuming television and film. So there, you could even say, oh, I only have capacity to focus on TikTok. Is TikTok alone going to shift a narrative that shifts a mindset? Probably not. But is it a good place to start? Yes, most likely, depending on who your audience is. And you might have an audience that isn't on TikTok at all, but that's unlikely. And so then it's like, okay, let's focus in here. And there's agencies that connect influencers to organizations. There's an excellent one I've worked with a lot. And so then it's a question of working, just starting off there, and you can test the content. You can test to see. So that can become a pilot for sort of, okay, now we want to move into other spaces. I think the key is to hire someone that can, even if they've not done this work extensively before, but is a comms person that can start doing some of this and finding some of the research entities to partner with, finding some of the agencies that do this work. And so TikTok is I think a really good place to start, at least right now. This might be look different in like a year, but yeah, I'm very happy to talk more about that. It's a much longer discussion, and it's my favorite thing to talk about. So yeah.
Awesome. One other thing I'm curious about is kind of goes off this question is that I feel like it's really hard to get into like Hollywood and TV, right? I feel like it's a challenge, at least for nonprofits, to kind of break into that space. Do you have any suggestions about folks that are trying to, build their cultural strategy, in particular using Hollywood or TV, or maybe we just need Coldplay, and that will help, right? But curious about that.
Yeah. So for the TV question, and I'm actually going to say something about Coldplay also. That's not what you think it is, but there are now kind of entities that help bridge to television, to Hollywood. So there is a way to start by doing that. So there's like agencies, there's individual consultants. So there are ways to kind of, they're like these sort of middle people There's not a lot of them, but they do exist, and there's some good ones. So that's one place to start. And when I say individuals, there's like individual sort of strategists that do this work. They kind of sit between, you know, the social change space and entertainment television. They have connections in Hollywood. So that's one way to go. Those people can also be contracted, and that's probably like a really smart thing to do. I know them all, most. And then there's the other thing I'd say is there's a couple of entities that are, so there's like entities that are actually created to bridge this space that are not contractors, but are like actually nonprofits. So the Norman Lear Center has something called Hollywood Health and Society. Hollywood Health and Society kind of bridges research with television. And so this costs money, but you can say, hey, you could, if they're interested in your issue, you can kind of pay them for a year to bring your issue to TV folks. And they have been working in television for like 30 years. Mostly they're health focused, but their definition of health and health equity is very, very broad. And so there's a bunch of sort of middle entities, so you don't have to kind of start from scratch, essentially. And I'd say that's probably the best way to go. I want to say something about the Coldplay thing, which is that they're not that one, but there are ways to orchestrate cultural moments. And there are agencies that orchestrate cultural moments for nonprofits. It's a hard thing to do. It costs money. It helps if you have a scandal connected to it, but we don't want that. So, but there are actually creating cultural moments is becoming harder and harder because it's very difficult to have a thing that so many people are paying attention to. But that is a tactic of cultural strategy that exists and is doable. Again, depending on who your audience is.
Yeah. Awesome. One last question before I close us out. How do you feel, Ishita, about our work as being ready for narrative change? And if you feel like we are, why do you feel like we are?
I think you are 1,000% ready for narrative change. I think it's a few things from what I know. It's actually quite a lot of investment in actually building the foundation, the groundwork of what are the mindsets we want to shift? What are the narratives that exist? Where do we want to move them? What are the framing strategies that work? I mean, you all have done that work. That is that piece of narrative intelligence that you need to build a strategy. And then the issue itself is this is going to sound crass and I don't mean it this way, but it's easier to get into talking about families, prevention, children. It's easier to get into some of those rooms than some of the other issues that executives are a little more nervous to touch. So I think from an issue perspective, especially in this environment, it might be easier to get into some of those spaces when other issues are like, I wouldn't say that about some other issues. So I think there's a set of sort of research and preparedness that you all have already invested in. I think the issue lends itself and the kinds of content that I think there's a wide range of the kinds of content where this issue could live, where these narratives could actually live. I could see. I mean, again, I don't know a lot about the target audiences, but I feel like network television is still being watched by a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of content on network television that would lend itself to your issue. Yeah, so I think those are, and you have the other strategies in place. So that's the other big piece. You are doing all the other work and you have the strategic comms infrastructure, you have the policy work, you have the organizing, you have all the other strategies kind of in place and well run and resourced. So I actually think that I don't know of a lot of others that are as well placed, not to undermine like the amount of resource and capacity that might need to be built. But I think you're very well positioned.
Awesome. Ishita, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be in your space. Thank you for the insightful and inspiring presentation. Again, we're incredibly grateful to you and Frameworks for your continued partnership and your leadership in this space, and always look forward to our continued work together. I also want to just say thank you to everyone who joined us today, everyone who stuck with us to the end as we continue to learn and work together to ensure that all children and families are living a purposeful and happy life with hope for the future. Our next Zooming Out session, you won't want to miss. It will be on September 22nd at 2 p.m. Central Time, and will feature Prudence Carr, the Center Director at the American Bar Association Center on Children and Law. And her presentation, if you have not heard it before, is amazing, thought-provoking, and we'll focus on how poverty became neglect in federal foster care and policy, and specifically focused on race, parental fitness, and financing. However, we will be in Portland, Oregon before then. August 12th through the 14th for our national conference, The Power of Prevention. There are over 1,100 people registered so far to date, and we're still a couple of weeks out. It's guaranteed to be one of the best conferences yet. So thank you again for joining us. We hope to see most of you in Portland. If not, we'll see the rest of you in September. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Bye.